Hey there guys, Templar here, and today I'll be talking to you guys about the Irish Wars of Independence, or, in other words, the Irish Rebellions. Now, when we normally think of the Irish Wars of Independence, we normally think about the conflicts such as the Troubles, or including the type of events that mainly happened around the 1960s to the 1990s. But in truth, these kind of conflicts actually pretty much happened in a different time era. When I mean different time era, I mean there was actually the original, and I'm talking like the very original Wars of Independence. These wars go way back in history books. How far back? Well, they go back all the way up to the late 1700s. And the early Irish Wars of Independence were one of probably the most gruesome conflicts in history. In fact, it divided brother against brother, son against son, and as well so on and so on. And doing so, both Ireland and including Britain kind of fought against each other in massive events. One of the major reasons of this ended up happening was actually kind of simple. The King of England, also known as the King James himself, or as we also know it as the conflict as the English Civil War, for example, is what causes the main problem. In fact, normally, if you ever talk to an Irishman, they would actually state that they've been fighting against the English for thousands of years. Well, that's actually kind of true, really. In fact, if we were to take a look at the history of the eras of the English, and including their invasion of Ireland, it normally comes around during the years of 10 or 11 AD. In other words, sometime after William the Conqueror. And in doing so, the English do advance inward, but in the process, it's only around at the time when it comes to the Protestantization of, well, England. And if you think about it, as soon as England became a Protestant nation by force and started to force its own subjects of Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and including Ireland to become Protestants when they were major Catholics, you can see why many of them didn't like it. Now, this actually, later on events, ended up going on, pretty much into 1798, in the first Irish Rebellion of 1798, which was unsuccessful in the process. It's actually stated that hundreds of thousands of Irishmen were slaughtered, and pretty much it was actually due to the reason being that many Irishmen were feeling as though their rights and such were being taken away. And as well, pretty much a lot of Irishmen saw that both France and America had become their own nations just to become a democracy against the British Crown. And that's what Ireland was wanting to fight for. They became a republic, and it was known as the the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, the early IRA, before we think of it today. Though the early IRA had different names, the Defenders, the Irish Republican Military, or including the People's Republic of Ireland. So in doing so, Ireland was fighting for its people. It was fighting against the idealism of serfdom. In other words, the type of government that was, well, downplayed every nation in history. Now, though, this actually didn't stop here. In fact, it was actually a whole 100 years for this war to keep going. In fact, the Irish Rebellion never fully ended. In fact, even if the 1798 didn't work, there was a second type of rebellion in 1803. And if you think about it, most of these battles or these conflicts only happened like around a decade from each other. Some of them, actually, it would only be surprising. In fact, most of the time, these conflicts were only actually around 3 years. Meaning that every time an Irishman would be put down, they would rise up again because the idealism of the English. If you guys don't realize this, the English government wasn't the best idea of a friend. If you guys don't understand this, the Irish were being treated as third-class citizens in their home country. They had to pay heavy taxes. They had to be forced with heavy laws, in which actually were discriminating the Irish. In fact, it's kind of like what we might see with Jim Crow laws in the United States. In fact, people were being segregated in their own towns, and as well, just because they were Catholics, it also made a secondary type of tax. If you're an Irishman, there's a tax. If you're a Catholic, there's a tax. But here's the thing, if you're both, you get double the taxes. which is probably why many of the Irish Republican Army were mostly Catholic Irish. And doing so, many Irishmen actually supported the idealism of an Irish free nation. Unfortunately, the British didn't see too well of this idea. There was even some peaceful talks about it, but even though the English thought a peaceful idea was a good idea, it was not actually for the British military government. If you guys don't understand this, the government of Britain did not like to lose its puppet states. In doing so, that's correct. They actually did declare war on Ireland again, though arresting a large amount of group members, starting with the so-called first Republican president named Omni Kamal, or Thomas Bell. Now this is before the Easter Uprising, guys. This is like in the 1860s. And it failed with the Peaceful Act failed very miserably, which, if you guys understand, was not the best idea to do it this way, because after the 1860 killing spree, as many Irishmen put it, it was actually stated that the English government can never be cooperated with, so open war was still pretty much on full effect. In fact, these type of conflicts kept on happening up until, well, the end of the Irish, well, conflict. And doing so, in other words, up until 1922. So think about this. This first started in 1798 and ended in 1922 with the final Irish Rebellion. Which, in doing so, this is actually one of the most gruesome facts about the history books. But people don't teach this part in history even though they should. Reason being, I'll actually get to the point. Now as well, during the type of younger years, during the 1836 and 1831, it was actually stated between this type of 5 years there was a massive conflict between the government and church, and including the idealism that the Irish were being treated like second-class citizens in their own country again. This time it was with the potato famine, and as well many people in the process even became burglars. They attacked English landlords. In fact, it got worse over the ages. In fact, this is actually what forced many Englishmen, governments, pretty much forced the English government to push out all the Irish from their homelands. In other words, think about it like this. Many people are being forced from their homelands and actually forced to sail to foreign countries. Many of them would be on none other than the Titanic. Now, though that was another event in history, but you get the point. But it is stated, though, that many of them would sail to many British colonies, or including former colonies. One of the biggest ones would be America, parts of Africa, and the biggest one also being Australia, which, as well, one of my subscribers from Australia has actually informed me that he also has Irish blood in his veins. Well, we can see of how he actually got his ancestry due to the fact Australia is technically the region in which many Irishmen, or including criminals to the crown, would actually be sent. In other words, if you were a criminal to the British government, you would have been sent there in the early eras. It was only because of the great mining areas that many people came over there. But here's the thing, though. Many Irishmen were discriminated against just because they were Catholics, and that was kind of messed up in a Protestant world. Seeing as though many countries were kind of still becoming Protestants instead of Catholics. If you guys don't understand the difference between a Catholic monarchy and a Protestant monarchy, the English Protestant Church was kind of not your best friend to a Catholics. You can see why, due to the Jacobite uprisings. But that's for another time. But now let's get to other rebellions, such as the Young Islander Rebellion. Now, the Young Islander Rebellions were one of the most complicated events in history. This type of event was actually different in history books. How so? Well, this event in history was actually understandable to, well, pretty much understand. Reason being, it was actually of many Irishmen, actually young Irishmen, fighting against the, well, corrupt police in Ireland. They were controlled by the British government. In doing so, it's actually estimated that this would even begin the very early version of the very first IRA. And in doing so, the Irish Republican Army, starting in this time in the year of 1848, in the process grew and grew. In doing so, they ended up becoming bigger and bigger every time. And as well, in 1867, There was also known as the Finnian Rising, in which failed, but still. It was actually stated that many uprisings did fail and only lasted a day, but you get the point. Though as well, many of these rebellions were still the most gruesome events in history, and still there were massive conflicts all throughout the British military government. Seeing as though most of the time the British kind of caused the problems, I'm not surprised. But as well, there was even the 1870 to 1893 Land War. The Land War was actually because of the idealism of many Irishmen being pushed off the land due to corrupt businessmen from, well, correct, the British government, or as well corrupt businessmen that were paid by the British government in Ireland. Now this is actually kind of messed up because of the idealism that many people in Ireland were forced off their farms, their family homes, everything, just for a couple of, well, acres of land. In which the English didn't do anything about it. They just kept it the same way. They forced Irishmen off their land, forced people that were in deep poverty to, well, leave their homes. They didn't know what to do. In fact, many of them took to the sword, or the gun, or whatever you want to put it at this point. In the process, well, as I state, went into open rebellion against the British government. Just think about that. It's kind of like today if the United States government was to take away land from every American civilian. In which, now I know one thing, that would not work out with every farmer. They would actually get pissed and go against the government, like they did in the 1860s. So, you can see why this actually has a big reputation in history books. That governments of corrupt governments do not work. Now, here's another part, though, that ended up leading to these type of conflicts. The Land War later related on to the Easter Uprising of 1916. Now, if you actually hear that year, 1916, that's correct. World War I. Now, I get you guys already. Templar, this means that Ireland was part of the Central Powers fighting against the British government and such, right? No. In truth, Ireland was neutral in the war. They were fighting for the freedom of their homeland. And seeing as though most of the British government was away on fighting against the Germans, or pretty much the Austro-Hungarians, it was kind of like, we could actually now spark an uprising. Well, technically the British government managed to send a couple of groups, and they managed to quash the rebellion in less than 5 days. So we can see why this didn't end well. But as well, a tribe of leaders actually emerged from this type of rebel. None other better than Michael Collins, which is probably one of my favorite, in fact he's actually one of my, I guess you might say, favorite Irish leader in history, seeing as though he was actually one of the most greatest leaders in Irish history as well. As well, he led the very nationalist IRA to lead them through the troubling times during the War of Irish Independence in 1919 and 1922. Now, in doing so, though, this was actually his greatest fight. In fact, soon after World War I, the Irish fought back again, and in doing so, brought their prime minister, or their first president. And the president in which wasn't born in Ireland. He was actually born in the United States, in New York. And this is actually an incredible part. Upon being born in the United States, he was spared by the British government because they couldn't kill an American on British soil. Otherwise, it kind of would start a, well, I guess you might say a massive ploy for the Irish to get the Americans to fight in the war. In which, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense back then. But still though, it was actually stated that in the process, he survived the Easter Uprising. And as well, if you guys don't understand, that there are many songs about this event of many of the leaders being executed. In which, without any trial. This actually also sparked many rebellions later on in history. Many Irishmen despised the British government because of their acts against the Irish people. And as well, the worst thing is, the English did this in plain view of open public. This only enraged the Irish even more. But as well, finally in 1922, the war finally ends. This was the last war for Irish independence. However, because of the English government, let's just say it did not work out so well. How you might say? Well, the English still had the northern half of Ireland. And as well, this divided Ireland, and as well, it led Ireland through a civil war. One between the nationalist IRA and including the Republican IRA. Now, if you guys wonder which one's which, the nationalist IRA is pretty much connected to the main government of the Republican government. In other words, the type of green shirts, or the green plaids. In other words, the type of divisions that nearly looked identical to the Brits, in which many Irishmen hated. In fact, this ended up causing many Irishmen to end up going to war against their fellow brothers. This actually is what actually happened to Michael Collins. He stood by the Nationalist Republican Army and was shot on an ambush. This event killed him in the process, which by far was probably the most saddest day in history. But still, the English government did this through and through in history books. Killed thousands of Irish men, women, and children, all civilians, just to control this land because of its resources. In doing so, Ireland was still, at the time, and still is under British rule. But due to the EU and due to the voting, both Scotland and Ireland might become a nation again. Northern Ireland might become a nation again, meaning that Northern Ireland might go back to the Republic. God willing. But as well, in the process though, this conflict in Ireland kept going on. Not because of religion, but worse, because of Britain. Britain controlled the lands of Ireland, and this kept on going through. In fact, this conflict got worse up into the 1960s, and during the time of the Troubles, this was the longest conflict in Irish history. This conflict of the Troubles was so brutal, it lasted from the late 1960s up until the 1990s. If you guys don't understand how long that is one of the most gruesome conflicts in history. Massive amounts of Irishmen were slaughtered on sight, taken to jail, and put on jail time without parole for no reason, just because they are Irish. In fact, many people, such as Bobby Sands himself, even protested against the idealism of many Irishmen being imprisoned just because they were Irish. Meaning, in fact, Bobby Sands himself even stood with a type of IRA division, but this IRA division was of a peaceful one, not a violent one. And so, in fact, it was only because of Margaret Thatcher that caused the problem in the first place. She enforced the laws in Ireland that in the process made Ireland become a terrorist division. Now, I'm not saying that all IRAs are bad. In fact, I actually support the original IRA and the peaceful IRA. It's the terrorist groups that are hard to understand. In doing so, even the British actually hired mercenaries to kill many innocent civilians just because they were Irish. This actually in the process even led to another terrorist group in Northern Ireland led by Northern Irishmen who are Protestant. This divided brothers against brothers. This was one of the most gruesome conflicts in history. And it's all because of the British government. Now, I'm not saying you Brits are bad. If any of you guys are from Britain and such, you're going to probably say, then why are you saying racist things about Britain? Well, here's the thing. I'm talking bad about the British government. Because in truth, it makes sense. You gotta take a look at the history books. If you don't take a look at the history books, they're just technically like spitting in the wind. Because in truth, it's actually true. You can't just mock up the history and think you can actually get away with it. In fact, the British government slaughtered innocent women and children all throughout Ireland during these conflicts. And in doing so, they managed to get away with it only because of the fact that it was never placed on historical news. But many Irishmen remember it in their songs and stories, including history books. I will also leave links down below for you guys, so that way you guys can understand the history of Ireland in the form of music. Now as well, I also advise you guys to also watch two movies. This would be The Winds That Shake the Barley and Michael Collins. These two films are historically accurate to the very point and show the gruesome events of what the English had done to the people of Ireland. In fact, many of the times, Irish people were killed in their churches. They were killed in their homes. They were attacked everywhere. These events in history were probably the most gruesome events all throughout Ireland, and still are. Many times, though, these conflicts are the most forgotten things in history. Mainly because we were not, here in the US, we were not part of it. But that's understandable. But many times we don't even remember it over there. But yet we should. seeing as though some IRA members go a little too far just to become an independent nation again. And yes, even in Northern Ireland there is still a massive problem. In fact, many people that are Catholics are actually discriminated against because they are living in a Catholic region, which sooner or later will pretty much come to an end. At least I hope. Anyways guys, this has been Templar. If you guys liked this video, let me know in the comments below. Also click that like button, and as well as subscribe for more videos, and as well click that bell button so that way you can be notified as soon as the next video comes up. Anyways guys, I will try my best to finish up most of Celtic history here on the month of March. Anyways guys, this has been Templar. Have a nice day.